real challenge of the future, and where a cultural age could be much more effective than an economic age is you'd find that balance that reduces the impact that we're having on the environment by opening up some of those more moral and ethical and artistic and creative activities. My name is Paul Schafer. I've worked in the cultural field for more than 50 years, and I'm director of the World Culture Project based in Markham, Canada. I grew up in Toronto, more or less in Midtown, and I had the very good fortune of having excellent parents who were very committed to giving myself and my brother Murray, who's a composer, a good education in the arts. My mother taught herself to play both the piano and the violin, and my father had no musical training, but somewhere along the line he fell in love with classical music. And he'd tell me a great deal about the works by Beethoven or Chopin or Rachmaninoff. I took piano lessons and singing lessons and sang in a choir and took art lessons. When I got to school, I got quite interested in sports and football and basketball, and spent a little bit longer than I should have in secondary school because I was actively involved in sports and playing billiards more than I was attending classes, but eventually got out of there and got on to university at the University of Toronto. During that time I got interested in economics and decided to go on and do an MA in economics.
So what got you interested in economics and continuing your education in that field?
Well, I guess there were a couple of reasons. My father was an accountant, basically a businessman. He worked for Imperial Oil for 45 odd years. I also had a brother who was struggling to be a composer and an artist, and I was aware that Van Gogh, the famous Dutch artist, his brother helped him a great deal because he had a terribly difficult time selling his paintings. So I was also motivated by the fact that I thought if I went into commerce and finance, I might be able to help my brother. As it turned out in the end, he succeeded far more quickly than myself, and he's a well-known Canadian composer and now well-known internationally as well. At the end of my commerce and finance training, one of our professors said to us that, one of the best things we could do over the summer, if we were able to do it financially, was to travel abroad and get some additional experience in another kind of way. And I first went to England and stayed with my brother Murray, then decided to go to Greece with a group of students from the University of London. And so I was always very interested in Greece because of its spectacular history during the classical period. And so when I came back to the University of Toronto and decided I'd go ahead and do a MA in economics, what made the most sense to me was that I should write my MA thesis on Greece as an undeveloped country. Very fortunately, when I finished my MA, there was a job possibility down at King's College in Nova Scotia, and I got a call from the principal of King's College who said that I had got the job if I'd like to take it. So it was a very interesting experience for me because in the spring I was a student studying at the University of Toronto, and by the fall I was standing up in front of a classroom of 50 or 60 undergraduates teaching a course in the principles of economics. So it was a bit of a rough ride there getting used to teaching. I finally just settled on United States as the place where I'd like to do a PhD, and decided on the University of Michigan. I hadn't lost my interest in the arts, and I thought, this might be an opportunity to link together my economic interests generally with my interest in the arts.
And are you sure the reason you chose Michigan had nothing to do with football?
Well, it did. When I was in high school, I followed the college football teams in the States religiously, and the Michigan Wolverines had a wonderful football team. It was just unbelievable during the Saturday afternoons in Ann Arbor. I was starting to get some real reservations about the direction in which economics was going as a discipline. It was getting very mathematical and technical, and one of the things that had always bothered me immensely about economics and my training in it was that the natural environment was either taken for granted or ignored in that discipline. The combination of these two things led to some major reservations in myself about whether or not I should go on and pursue a PhD in economics. I started to feel more and more that I needed to really get away. So I traveled in Europe for about a year. I spent a lot of time in the south of Europe, in southern France and Italy and Spain and over to Morocco and so on. And I began to realize that a lot of the centers that were key centers for cultural and artistic reasons, you know, such as in Italy, Venice and Siena and some of the other Rome and some of the other countries, Florence, they were also key economic centers. So the two things were going on simultaneously. And what interested me about that was I came to the conclusion that in some cases the arts seemed to be the more important factor in driving the development of those places. In other cases it seemed to be the economic dimension. So there seemed to be more of a mix going on. It wasn't just that it was economics and then the arts were tacked on later. It was more like an interaction between the two things.
You say that we are living in an economic age. What do you mean by that?
Well, this is something that I've been pressing very, very hard in my later years, because I think it's important to be specific about the kind of age that we're living in, because it makes us aware of many things that are going on in the world we're living in. And I came to the conclusion that it really was an economic age, in the sense that we're all, as people and as members of society in the world, we're all deeply immersed in a whole series of economic issues, starting with the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services, and our desire to have higher standards of living and a better quality of life, and most importantly, I feel that most of the important decisions that are now being made by governments, by corporations, by international institutions like the United Nations or the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund or the World Trade Organization, they're all making them on the basis of economics as the first and most important factor.
When did the economic age really start, and how did it develop?
Well, this was part of my interest in the history of economic thought. There's no doubt about when it started, and no doubt about the date it started. It started in 1776 when Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, and that book was really based on the idea that if we wanted to improve our standard of living and quality of life, we should specialize in some particular production function that he showed. He took the example of a pin factory, and he said, you know, if each person made each pin and did all of the things that they had to do to make the pin, they'd make far less pins than if each person specialized in a very specific aspect of the production function. You know, one might get the steel, one might roll the steel, one might shape the steel, and so on. But he also argued that the best thing that could happen is that if each individual pursued their own self-interest, that this would lead to the best collective good for people in a society or a country. What he did from there was develop a whole elaborate theoretical and practical system of economics to show how these objectives of improving standards of living and quality of life could be increased. So that was the kickoff. This was followed by a long line of very famous economic thinkers in the development of the economic age was Karl Marx. And Karl Marx is best known in the world today, as I think probably everybody in the world knows, for his theories of class struggle and eventually on the basis of that, the breaking up of the world into capitalist components and communist components, and then the Cold War that developed for such a long time in Europe and other parts over the world to try and show which system was superior. Was it the capitalist system or the communist system? And basically what Marx argued is that if you look at any society, you can really break it into two parts. One part, which he called the economic base, being economics. The other part being everything else, whether it's the arts, sports, religion, politics, education. And Marx said in his economic interpretation of history that there's kind of a unilateral flow from the base to the superstructure. In other words, economics is the cause, everything else is the effect. And this had a tremendous impact on, I think, individual and collective thinking in many areas about the direction in which the world should go. That people in the academic and political corporate communities felt that Marx had uncovered a universal truth here. Because Marx said the economic interpretation of history is not only true now, it was true in the past, and it will be true in the future. It was a very deterministic kind of theory that said economics should always be at the center of everything, and everything flows from economics. And so you get a progressive development. First it starts in terms of people saying, okay, you know, we buy Marx's argument, so let's now start to flesh it out. And this is why you get all those developments taking place in Europe and North America and departments of economics, developing the various areas of economics, developing indicators that we use today to measure what our satisfaction is in life, such as gross national product, net national product, rate of economic growth, per capita income. Those all came out of the Marxian economic interpretation of history. What happened from there is that once this system was fairly well developed in terms of people being involved in economic occupations, corporations supplying all the goods and services that people wanted, we had the crash, the great crash of 1928 to 1938, when the stock market just dropped, and you know, so many people lost their jobs. What was required was you know, an economist that could sort of explain how that had happened and how we could get out of it. And that was a British economist named John Maynard Keynes, and he developed you know, quite complicated theory of monetary and fiscal policy, but it basically revolved around the idea that governments should get in there. I mean, we already had people and we had corporations. Now we're adding governments. Governments had to get in there, and when times were bad, they had to spend, because if they spent money, that would provide people with jobs and consequently income, and then they'd be able to buy the goods that corporations were producing, and you get a kind of a spiral going up. So what you're seeing here now, it's now getting into all sectors of society. Citizens are involved through consuming and producing as they do in their jobs. Corporations were very involved because they were creating all the goods and services. But now governments were also very involved, and my argument would be that governments got so involved that economics became their priority even above politics. So now the economic system is in government, corporations, and citizens, but it's only in the Western world. And so what happens from here? Well, interestingly, what happened from here is that the Western world, and particularly the United States, started to look more and more at other parts of the world, and especially like countries like India and China, and thinking, wouldn't it be wonderful if all of these goods and services that we want to produce through our corporations could be sold to people in India and China? Not, I suppose, thinking out very clearly that in order to buy the goods that were being produced by American corporations, people in India and people in China had to have the income to buy the goods. And of course that set off a very different kind of development in the world. It's the equivalent in hockey to the term that they often use when there's a great player or a big player, and the statement is often made, "Don't poke the bear." And I'm afraid that the bear was poked in the case of China and India, and of course they've started to produce, and just as Great Britain was known as the workshop of the world in the 19th century, now of course China, I think, is more seen as the workshop of the world in the 20th century. And so what is happening now is that the economic system, the economic age as I've called it, is not only penetrating in all the Western countries, it's also penetrating in all the other countries in the world. And what gave this particular momentum over the last decade or two is the whole process of what is called globalization, which is extend things out to other parts of the world with the idea that we're now all big one global world, and with one big global world we have one big economic age, where the basic commitment in that whole age is economics first and everything else second. I think it wouldn't be difficult to justify the claim that the economic age is the greatest human achievement in history by far. I mean, we talk about great human achievements, and we say, and many of the references that we use in that are technological, like going to the moon or going to Mars, or expanding our understanding of the size and complexity of the universe and the galaxies and so on. So we usually use technological things like that, or the invention of the telephone or radio or television or the cell phone. But there's no doubt in my mind, if you really think about it, that the greatest achievement of humanity is the creation of the economic age. And that's because in this age, which started with 1776 with the Wealth of Nations and comes up to the present time, billions of people, mostly in the West in the earlier years, but more recently in all parts of the world, have had their standard of living and quality of life increased quite considerably. It's a phenomenal achievement, phenomenal achievement. Here's where push comes to shove, and we have to do the hard slugging in terms of making an objective assessment of the economic age. So I'm just giving you my personal assessment of this, but it's an assessment based on what I feel is objectivity and not subjectivity. The biggest shortcoming of the economic age is the devastating impact or effect the economic age is having on the natural environment. There is an environmental crisis in the world, and I think that crisis is basically a crisis that has to do with climate change and global warming, and also growing shortages of basic natural resources and foodstuffs. These resources, some of them you can reproduce, but many you can't. Once they're gone, they're gone. They're like species. If some species are just extinct, you can't bring them back. And I think that we have to be very, very careful in the future about what's happening to resources and foodstuffs in terms of the rate of population growth. If we don't give consideration to that, I mean, that it's not going to be very long if prices are going up for goods and people can't buy food, that there are going to be major confrontations and clashes between people and groups and nations. So that's something I think that has to be configured into the environmental equation if we're talking about the environment as an entity and how serious is the crisis that exists in it. Now, people that are economists or people that want to make the case that we should just go on in the economic age indefinitely would say, well, look at all we're doing now in terms of the environment. You know, we now have environmental assessments. we're now trying to create green economies and we're trying to control pollution more. But I think at its root, the problem with this is that when you develop a whole system of theory and practice, and it's based on excluding the natural environment from any consideration, the architectural equivalent to this would be very much like building a huge city or building a colossal office tower on sand or on muck or something that there's no foundation. And that's what's missing in all of this, that the economic age is resting on faulty foundations. And I don't believe that it's possible after 250 years to take the natural environment and insert it into the ideology of the economic age after the fact. I think there are three major problems in the world today that are really the crucial problems. And one is the state of the environment and the need to do something about that in the future. One is the unequal or inequitable distributions of income and wealth between rich and poor, which, as we know, are getting enormously out of hand when we talk about the 99% and the 1%, and the 1% having, mountains of money and almost as much as the 99%. And the third problem is, as a result of globalization, the intermingling and intermixing of people that have very different worldviews, values, value systems, cultures, customs, traditions, and so on. So those, to me, are the three basic problems. And the point of my argument would be that none of those three problems can be fixed by the economic age, because it wasn't designed to deal with problems like that. It was designed to produce goods and services and material and monetary wealth. And those three things, apart from maybe the second one with the distribution of income, have very, very little to do with the age of economics or with economics generally. One could say, well, there is something that could be done about the distribution of wealth, and that is that governments could impose taxation systems that move money from the rich to the poor and give the lower and middle classes in society a better break in terms of the overall distribution of income. That sounds great in theory. In practice, I think what we find is that governments are very, very reluctant to get into questions dealing with the distribution of wealth, because they're very controversial, they're very confrontational. People that are rich don't want to give up their wealth. People that are poor want the wealth and can't gain access to it. And so governments have tended, because the distribution problem is so difficult, to say, well, let's just produce more wealth and then everybody get pulled up and have higher standards of living and a better quality of life. But we've seen over the last decade or so that's not working. And so what they're arguing is, or put the emphasis into production and consumption, and we'll deal with the distribution of wealth by more production and more consumption. The problem, of course, with that is more production and more consumption means more goods and services are produced, economic growth has to be greater, and more devastation is done to the natural environment. So I don't think we can solve that problem by saying let's produce more and consume more. When you put all those difficulties together with the economic age, the conclusion that I came to is that we have to move out of an economic age in the future. Different people have different ideas about where we should go from here. Should it be an information age? Should it be an artificial intelligence age? Should it be a technological age, a religious age, a spiritual age? I mean, there are a lot of different options, and different people have made different arguments for the new type of age that should merge in the future. But my particular interest is in a cultural age, and what could be achieved in a cultural age that can't be achieved in an economic age.
You state in your book, Revolution or Renaissance, that we need to start entering a cultural age. Mm-hmm. Tell me a bit more about that.
Okay, The full title of the book is Revolution or Renaissance, Making the Transition from an Economic Age to a Cultural Age, and it's divided into two parts. Part A, part one, is the age of economics. Then part two is the age of culture. And one of the reasons I called it Revolution or Renaissance is to provide the implication that if we continue on the way we're going now, the result is going to be a revolution. And the problem with that is that it's not going to be the kind of revolution that people say are important when they talk about the need for a political revolution because they're overthrowing a bad government and introducing a good government. When I talk about revolution in terms of that book, what it means is that you're going to have more chaos and disaster and more fighting with different groups and different people and so on. The alternative, in my view, is to go into a renaissance. Well, Renaissance has some implications too in terms of the use of the term. When we usually talk about Renaissance today, we mean, well, the Renaissance in classical Italy that was so exciting and dynamic and eventually went on and spread through other countries in Europe and then to countries in other parts of the world. And it was all done on the basis of going back to classical times and reviving the arts and culture and traditions of antiquity. What I'm talking about when I'm talking about a renaissance is not only the ability to have a more flowering period in history of humanity, but also and particularly that we don't need to go back to the classical period, but we do need to go back to something. And what I'm arguing basically in that book is what we should go back to is the work that a whole series of anthropologists, cultural historians as well, but a whole series of anthropologists did when in the latter part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, they traveled to a lot of different parts of the world. And I think there was a feeling among anthropologists soon after the discipline was created that if we don't go back and study those societies, they're going to disappear and we're going to lose a very important part of the cultural heritage of humankind. What they discovered is that virtually all of those societies had words for the individual activities that the people were involved in. What they didn't have was a word that described how all this was sort of put together and woven together in different combinations to create a kind of a whole society. And so that's why Tyler, who is one of the earliest anthropologists, if not the first, defined culture formally as the complex whole that includes all the activities in a society. So it was different. It wasn't just economics. It wasn't just politics. It wasn't just education or recreation. It was everything put together and how those things got interwoven and blended together. Very fascinating idea, and this was one of the major discoveries and why he called that culture rather than using some other term. In addition to that, I think what the anthropologists also discovered was that those societies that didn't pay particular attention to their environmental surroundings and settings were in for a rude awakening and possibly would collapse because they overextended themselves and they used up all the resources and the society just couldn't sustain itself any longer. So this was the difference between the economic age and the cultural age, in my view. Culture, which is the whole, but culture that takes the environment into consideration because it's the most important factor in our life and in the world. I mean, if we don't look after the environment, we're in for doom because everything and everybody are connected to the environment in multiple ways. So that to me started me to think about how we might be able to have a renaissance rather than a revolution. This is fascinating because going right back to Cicero, who lived before Christ, he defined culture as the philosophy or culture of the soul. And when I read that the first time, I was so struck by that. I thought, isn't that a remarkable insight, you know, into a lot of things that have to do with cultivation, environment, philosophy, and the soul of people, which is supposedly at the basis of our lives. So, and then I started to explore the works of all these other anthropologists. Now, they're known, but they're only largely known in the anthropological field and maybe in a couple of other adjacent cultural fields such as sociology or the arts or biology and so on. But generally, all of those ideas that were created by anthropologists and others were ignored. And when I started to read the literature provided by all those people, what started to form in my mind was a cultural vision of the world of the future. So I was convinced that you could create a cultural age based on the theories of Cicero, Voltaire. Voltaire wrote a lot about culture, although he didn't use the term as such. Herder, who was quite a well-known German philosopher, Tyler, Jacob Burckhardt. I'd go off to the library at Scarborough campus of the University of Toronto and read these works of cultural scholars. And that's where it started to form in my mind that we could talk about a cultural age, and a cultural age based on a flourishing of culture in general as a kind of a holistic, total way of life, but very much infused by the arts, aesthetics, morality, the search for beauty. Slowly but surely this idea of culture started, and a cultural age started to unfold for me, and it made it possible for me to write the second part of the book on the age of culture. Throughout the course of history, there were more than 150 different perceptions and definitions of culture in the world. I say this because, and it is a problem that has to be addressed in a cultural age, and I've tried to address it both in Revolution and Renaissance, and an earlier book I wrote on Culture Beacon of the Future, where the first 3 chapters are taken up with this problem of defining culture. It's a difficult problem because different people will have different understandings when you use the term culture, and yet we have to find a common definition. The interesting thing is when UNESCO decided to hold its first World Conference on cultural policy, when it was inviting people from the different member states of UNESCO to come to Venice, where they held this. It's a great place to hold the first World Conference on Cultural Policy in Venice. When they came to Venice to talk about cultural policy, they had to have agreement in advance that they would not discuss what they meant by the term culture. And can you imagine going to a conference if you're saying, I'm going to a conference in economics, but we're not going to talk about what economics means, and we're certainly not going to talk about how you define economics. So it's a crucial problem. They made a lot of progress at the conference. These were all people from ministries of culture or ministries of religion and culture, but they had quite a successful conference, but nobody talked about the definition. Well, if you're talking about going into an age in the sense that, like an economic age, 250 years, a cultural age, what could it be? 200, 300 years, then it doesn't make any sense whatsoever to not talk about how you understand culture. So my perception of culture and my definition of culture that I use as a working definition is that simple one provided by Tyler. Culture is the complex whole, or it's the total way of life of people. If you're creating any whole, then what it is a blending of all of the particular parts of that whole. And if you find a good balance and harmony between all those parts, then you have a very effective whole. If you don't find a good balance and harmony, if there's clashing going on between those various parts, then you have disharmonies and imbalances. So to me, what's at the very root of the age of culture is how you create the balance and the harmony between a variety of activities or forces. Because Huizinga said, after he studied many, many cultures in the world, basically he said the power of economics, of technology, of science, of industrialization must be balanced by strongly developed aesthetic, artistic, creative, spiritual, moral, ethical values. And that, to me, is the foundation for developing a cultural age, that we give equal attention to those two things. The more the economic age evolves and the momentum increases in an economic age, the more we become preoccupied with material and monetary wealth and goods and services, and the less, not the more, the less consideration we give to aesthetic, moral, ethical, spiritual values. And so it seems to me that the real challenge of the future, and where a cultural age could be much more effective than an economic age, is you'd find that balance that reduces the impact that we're having on the environment by opening up some of those more moral and ethical and artistic and creative activities. So that's my general belief about what should drive a cultural age in the future. After the Second World War, the United Nations decided to have a number of decades of development. The first decade, of course, was economics. But eventually they got around to having an environmental decade. What followed was the UN Decade on Culture. And it was an attempt over a period of 10 years to focus specifically on the role of culture in global development and human affairs. I decided that I wanted to start a world culture project to commemorate and coincide with the World Decade for Cultural Development. It was divided into an international component and a Canadian component, and my plan was to write monographs on particular cultural issues in both components over that 10-year period. I was using the international component to address general issues, and then the Canadian component to say, well, how do these general issues apply to a specific culture? But basically it was an attempt, and still is, it's still operating, it was an attempt to bring to the fore a lot of the thinking of generations and indeed centuries of people that were culture scholars or had written about cultural issues. Because I felt that there wasn't any literature really. There was a lot of literature on culture as the arts and culture and humanities, because that's the way it evolved in the classical period of history. But there was virtually nothing on culture as a complex whole or a total way of life that was applied to today and tomorrow rather than yesterday. The Age of Culture project is a project designed to generate discussions through the creation of what I'm calling cultural hubs in different parts of the world. So if you take a particular hub, the one that has started and is most advanced is in the Ukraine, that has its headquarters now at a national university in Kiev, and they have there a research institute for spirituality and a UNESCO chair for upbringing and education in cultural spirituality for young people. And specifically, they're talking about how their research and activities and publications concerning training and education for young people for living in a cultural age blends with this idea generally. Those are really the two basic dimensions or functions of these cultural hubs. Kick off a discussion about the need for a cultural age, then relate your own activities to considering how that applies. There's so many dimensions in life that the arts touch on. Everything from the heart, the soul, the mind, the imagination, the senses, the creativity. It's all there in the arts. So the arts can expand our consciousness internally, but they can also bring us much more into contact and communications with the natural environment, which is so essential today. I took art lessons and music lessons when I was younger, so I mean I've been able to go back to the piano later on. I would say that if you're in the home, then arts and craft work would probably be the best place to start, because I think without too much training you can get into those fields more quickly. The problem with learning to play a musical instrument, which is an exciting experience, it's a bit like learning to play tennis. You have to have a lot of practice before you can play a decent game, and if you're learning the violin or a trumpet or the piano, sometimes you have to spend a considerable amount of time before you can play pieces that you're satisfied with. So it's a little harder to sort of get involved in those, but listening to music definitely would be one that I'd strongly emphasize, and I believe very much in listening to popular and classical music. They both have something to offer. If it's outside the home, you couldn't do any better than joining a choir. Choirs are a great way to enjoy yourself, get involved in music, and have a terrific time. I think in terms of the case that I'm trying to make in all of my writings, the case is this, that the development of culture and cultures should be at the centerpiece of the development of the world in the future. And what should be at the centerpiece of culture and cultures? I feel it should be the arts. Not only are the arts coming into much more prominence now because we're seeing that the arts are useful at every stage of the life process, from the earliest years of childhood to the very, very final years of adulthood. So the arts are the gateway, if you like, the practical and easy to understand gateway to culture and cultures, that we can open up on our understanding about culture and cultures through the arts. And not only the performing, exhibiting, creative, literary arts, but also the culinary arts, the architectural arts, the material arts or the crafts. They all have different capabilities that they can bring to the table in helping us to become much more conversant with what the development of culture and cultures is really all about, and why it's so important in the world of the future. The cultural community, which I would say is the community of people who believe in either the centrality of culture or that culture has a very important role to play in the future, they have to provide the driving force in the same way that environmentalists provided the driving force for the environmental developments that have taken place in the last 30 years. Artists, people that are involved in the cultural industries, filmmakers, people that are making radio, television programs. I'm talking about anthropologists, sociologists, cultural historians. These people have to come together and decide that they're going to make a collective case and create a collective voice for the importance of culture in the development of countries. Next to that, I think governments have the key role to play, because good governments have to have the holistic perspective that is necessary to take the past, the present, the future into consideration, as well as the environment, the humans, the people, other species, in making the decisions about what are most appropriate in the future. And ultimately, of course, people play the greatest role of all because they have to shift from a world that's been based on economics to a world that's been based on culture. And they have to give real consideration to what it means to reduce the impact we're having on the environment and other species.
Is there any of those artists in particular you admire currently that are doing innovative work in this regard?
Well, I think a lot are. I admire my brother the most. He's always done a lot of that in his life. That's why I think he could easily be defined as an environmental artist. Murray is the kind of person that he makes tremendous demands on people in terms of their time and their energy and their effort. And that's why so many of his pieces are performed or presented outdoors rather than indoors. What he really wanted to do in his work was take music out of the concert hall and display it and present it and perform it outdoors in different kinds of environmental settings. Into the forest I go to lose my mind and find my soul. I kind of feel you couldn't go wrong if you try and model your life on nature, because nature really has to do with transformation, change, mutations, different ways of doing things, getting into the flow of things, understanding how nature functions, how it cleans itself, how it expresses itself. So I've tried to model my life's development on nature, and I find probably the best way to do that of all is to have some long walks in the forest, because it not only brings you very close to nature, but also it's a very spiritual experience, and it helps tremendously in clearing your mind and refreshing your vitality and your creativity. If somebody asked me to make a short statement about living a cultural life, living in a cultural age would be all about, I would say it's probably Goethe, the famous German poet and scholar, who said, live in the whole, live in the good, and live in the beautiful. And I think that pretty well sums up for me, and it has for a long period of time, what it means to live a cultural life.